it is always very important to be able to hear the words, the words written of the page through the voice of the author. So we look forward to hear you read an excerpt of The Thing About December. I have some trouble thinking about it as The Thing About December, since we decided to call it A Year in the Life of Johnsey Cunliffe. And a change that you approved, and because we had some difficulties, trying to come to a French title with The Thing About December, because ce truc à propos de décembre. Can we first start, because what is very interesting in your work is and you said it the past 2 days to French interviewers, you are really focused on the voice of people. Has it always been the case since you became a writer?
It has, really, because I struggled for 10 years. I have this thing in my head that I had 10 wilderness years in a haunted apartment in Limerick, and it was kind of my left bank of the Seine, really, because it was in a kind of secluded area in Limerick City, and I had a friendly ghost who I had a great relationship with, and I was a frustrated artist. I was a civil servant. I was a pure cliche, really. And I sat in this apartment night after night trying to write, and was never able to write more than a few pages without feeling kind of sick. It just never seemed right. And I could hear the voice of my old English teacher in my head constantly saying, "Ryan, you're a writer. Don't waste your talent." And he put it in far more earthy terms than that, but I won't repeat what he said exactly. And finally, I decided to write a novel in the voice of the people of the place where I'm from. And it started to flow, and it became easy. And it's never really easy, but it started to not make me feel sick. So it was working. And what came out was a fairly awful novel, reading back. But it was saved by one character, who was Johnsey. So I took Johnsey from that novel and gave him one of his own after I got married, and was forced to write a novel by my wife because we were broke and we needed about 10 grand very badly. So I said, I'll write a book. And so kind of, the demotic voice, the vernacular, was kind of my way into being able to write.
And you said that voices come from a place. Could you tell us a little bit about this place? Because you told someone today or yesterday that you were living only 20 miles away from the place of your birth. So it sounds like you have a special connection to this place, the place your fiction comes from.
Yeah, I'm terrible. I'm a big baby, really. I can't be too far from home. 4 days away from home really is my limit. And I can't be too far from Tipperary, which is awful. A drawback in life. It really holds me back. But and I've been told, actually, I got the voice completely wrong of North Tipperary, and then I've been told it's completely right. But in The Spinning Heart and in this book, this book is in the third person, but it's a very close third person. And I can't pay tribute enough, actually, to my French translator, Marina Barrasso, who has done an unbelievable job. I think she's a genius, because she's kept Johnsey the way he is, I think, when he speaks in his own voice, in the French edition. And it's I was born in a small village near Nina, and people where I'm from speak it's not a strange way to me, but they speak in jokes and in what we call slags. So they speak, they'll tell you something about yourself that's terrible, but they'll say it in a very jocular way, and it'll be a big laugh. And you have to be very alive to the undercurrent, to the subtext of seriousness in all of the things that are said. And I've been terribly criticized for saying this, but I always say it. We took English in Ireland because English was forced upon us as a people, going way back. And we have, I think, erased memory when it comes to language, because we inverted the syntax. We retained our Gaelic syntax, so we inverted English syntax, and we just overlaid it on the Gaelic. And we kept talking in lies and in hyperbole and jokes. And I always say, just one example is Tá ocras an dónarm. How hyperbolic is that? The hunger of the world is on me. We can't just say, I'm quite hungry. We have to say, the hunger of the world, the whole world's hunger is on me, which is kind of beautiful in a way. And so that's kind of, and also my wife is from West Limerick, and West Limerick isn't far from North Tipperary, but they have a completely different way of speaking there in the same vein. So I've kind of a mishmash of West Limerick and North Tipperary in the books, which can be quite confusing. But only for people from those areas. From outside, I think it's fine.
And what is striking reading your fiction is you're really interested in capturing the way people communicate with each other in this place. You know. The vernacular is something which interests you. You said once that the world is filled with unwelcome words, because there is also a sobriety. How do you work? Do you listen to a lot of people? Do you retain certain memories of your childhood? How because you have a very particular way of writing. You know, it feels like when we read your work, like the room is filled with people. You know that we are really part of one community. How do you translate this on the page?
You know, actually, it sounds a little bit creepy almost. You know, when I think of myself actually eavesdropping on conversations and listening for things people are saying and watching people like that. But I do it, I have to say. I heard Come to Bean actually say this on radio. He said, you have to plunder the lives of people around you, and you have to feel no guilt about it. You have to do it. And, you know, so I steal people's stories all the time and use them for my own ends. And I pay them nothing. It's all free. I just steal, which is great. But in this book, I mean, Johnsey Cunliffe is almost completely silent, but he has a very chaotic inner discourse that runs throughout the book. So Johnsey inwardly never shuts up, but outwardly barely speaks. I think in the whole book, there are maybe 2 or 3 lines of dialogue that come directly from Johnsey's mouth, but everything else is inside his head. And it's kind of, you know, with the spinning heart, pretty much every incident in the book, because it really is a series of 21 almost confessions, and they were all stolen directly from people around me in my life, friends, family, everyone. And with this book, Johnsey is kind of a composite character. I knew loads of people exactly like Johnsey growing up in school. I worked for years at weekends as a driving instructor. And there were a few guys who came to me for lessons every single Saturday without fail. And after about 3 years, because I'm really thick, it takes me ages sometimes to pick up on things. And after about 3 years, I realized that 2 or 3 of these guys were coming for driving lessons for company, because they lived lives where they were almost completely alone. They had inherited small farms and their parents had passed away. You know, their siblings were either gone or they were only children. And they lived almost fully alone with just animals to communicate with. And so they had, and I could see they constructed a kind of reality around themselves. You know, they'd created a way for them of surviving, because I can't imagine being that alone. And so that kind of thing really struck me. My first novel, Spinning Heart, was dedicated to a man called Dan Murphy, who was my wife's uncle. And I met him maybe a handful of times in my life. He died shortly before the book came out. But he had a profound effect on me. The way he approached the world was so amazing and so beautiful. He'd leave his cottage in the mornings and he'd cycle to the village for his breakfast. I mean, he was like something from the 1920s. It was amazing. And he spent his days just looking at birds and walking in the fields and looking at animals. And yeah, he had a few cattle and he did a bit of wheeling and dealing, but mostly his life was spent completely alone, and he was very happy. But he had created something. He created some kind of cloak around himself, of protection. And the way that he approached the world and reality was just amazing. And he thought a lot about the nature of reality. I mean, he was a very quiet man. You know, somebody who didn't know him would say, he's a bit of a God help us, we'd say. You know, he's a bit simple, he's a bit slow. But he was ferociously intelligent. And when he died, his brother opened a cupboard in his room, which was completely full of books on science and nature and every kind of thing. And that kind of life, to me, is fascinating.
And we should say a few words maybe about Johnsey, because Johnsey is different from everyone. We don't know exactly. He's 24-year-old. He's a farm boy. He lives with his parents. And we don't know if his state is the result of too much love, you know, too much protection from his parents, or if he's suffering from disability. We don't know exactly, but he is somebody which does not talk, to say nothing. And it fits your definition. The world is filled with unwelcome world. Were you looking for a certain sense of expression coming from his mouth and from his brain? How did you imagine such a character? You know, it could be, everyone here has seen Forrest Gump. He could be an Irish Forrest Gump in one way, because he's not dumb. He's very smart. You know, he's very sensitive and very true, very honest.
Just on that, actually, I saw a very unkind review on Goodreads of this book, and the review in total, and maybe I'm unfairly presuming it was an American, but the review was, "Dumbass inherits farm," and that was the whole review. And I was there going, I really thought I portrayed Johnsey as intelligent, as having this real serious precocity and intelligence inwardly. But Johnsey, the whole book is an exposition of Johnsey's interior, even though he's fully silent, and all the conflicts inside him. And he's quite complicated and complex, as we all are, but still the world to him is black and white and quite unnuanced. He's got a very kind of naturally Christian outlook on life, about being kind and not hurting anybody. And it's very innate for him because of the way he was reared. Because his parents are based vaguely on my own parents, who really protected me far too much. Because I grew up thinking I was great, which is good, but I was never told about the harshness in the world or the coldness in the world. I was given no warning at all about these things until I was 15, and I was kind of out there in the world going, Jesus, the world's a terrible place. My parents said it was great. They said I was beautiful and I was fantastic, and no one else thinks this. And Johnsey's kind of the same. Johnsey has been cosseted. He's been kept, wrapped up in cotton wool by his parents because they could see that he was weak, but made no effort to kind of toughen him up. Not that they have an obligation to make him tough. And I kind of loved that idea, and I loved that character, and I've seen this kind of life played out over and over again. And I know people who are ignored and written off as humans. And then I was thinking about that today, when I walked from here up to Montparnasse, the amount of people I met in the street who were begging and who were probably written off by most people as well. We write people off all the time. We'll write off people because they're different, or because of a crime they've committed, or because of the situation they're in. We just write them off, and we will naturally devalue people and divest them of worth as humans because of their circumstances or because of something about them. And it's a natural thing. This happens naturally. It's something that we have to combat in ourselves, I think. And that's so it is with Johnsey. Johnsey has no real way of interacting with the world. He has no way out in the end. He's backed into a very, very tight corner. And still, I worry about him, and he became very real for me. And I sometimes make a bit of a fool of myself about the character of Johnsey, and I kind of admit to getting upset writing him and all these silly things. And my wife says, start lying, but I'm unfortunately hindered by honesty when it comes to this kind of thing. And even when the book came out, the first day the book came out, it was reviewed terribly in a paper called The Cork Examiner. And my friend, the reviewer, hated the book. Fair enough. His review was quite sneering. And I became murderous. I flew into a murderous rage. And I went to my shed, got my hurley, and put the hurley in my boot, and was leaving my house to go to Galway to kill him, to beat him to death. And my wife stopped me, thank God.
It doesn't look like what something Johnsey would do. Huh?
No, exactly. I thought of Johnsey. I thought of gentle, pure Johnsey, and thought, I can't do this. But it's because it seemed to me as though he had attacked this person who I loved, Johnsey, and that he'd taken this gift I created for my wife and taken it from her hands and thrown it on the ground and stamped on it and spat on it. But that's my own childish idiocy. But that's my point, is that Johnsey became so real for me that I was thinking in these crazy terms about him.
Was he based upon people you met during your youth, or from where does this character come from? Are you a part of? Is he a part of you? Is he a part of people you met? Because he's a very peculiar character. He's childlike, but he's very sensitive and he's very smart, and he comes from a very distant place. And a place which seems to permeate your work, which is rural areas, the country.
Johnsey really is. I have to admit that he really is a composite of a handful of men that I knew and boys. There are scenes in the book, like for example, at one point he's going to a disco on a minibus, a youth disco, and someone sets fire to his sweater, his jumper. And I saw this happen, and I was on that bus and I was laughing, and I dragged this massive burden of guilt out of school. I think we all do. We're all damaged to some degree by our schooling. We'll either witness bullying or we'll be bullies or be bullied, I think. There's no way of avoiding it, unfortunately. And so we all drag some kind of burden of pain to a greater or lesser extent from our school years. And I just felt guilty. I felt really bad. I felt I should have been stronger. I should have stopped these things happening. I should never have left. But, when you're a kid, it's almost impossible. And so it's a book. The book, in a way, is an apology of sorts. It's my apology for the bullying that I allowed to happen around me, and that sometimes I was peripherally involved in.
A way to redeem yourself.
Yeah, but still it's no good. I mean, it's no good now. It's too late.
No.
It's a day late, dollar short, and it's never going to change the past.
But when we were talking about the place Johnsey comes from, it's not a place of tranquility, it's not a pastoral place, it's a place filled with tensions. And you decided to set the novel at a very specific time. Could you say a few words about this, the crisis you worked on, which Johnsey is going to face, because Johnsey loses his father, and then soon after his mom dies, and he's left alone, and suddenly he inherits a farm that everybody is looking at for profit, because developers are very much interested in these lands, and they want to make something good for the entire community, but it has to go through Johnsey first. What was the idea behind this plot? What did you want to show? A clash of cultures between the...
Well, when it comes to land, I mean, I have witnessed people quite close to me in my life being driven literally mad by land, by the notion of land, and by ownership and property and money and notional values of land, and land changing hands and going the wrong way. And it's just, I mean, it consumes people sometimes. Property consumes people. I've seen people whose lives are destroyed because they're so wedded to property and to land. And you see, it's fine for me because my dad was in insurance. My mum worked in a supermarket, but they were both from farms, but they didn't inherit land, so we were unshackled. But I got to see it very close up. The tension, this constant tension that exists that can sometimes blow up. Now, almost always it's fine. But when it goes wrong, it's terrible. When families are fractured because of property and ownership and that kind of thing, you can feel this constant palpable tension, and sometimes it with terrible consequences it blows up, and it happens very dramatically for Johnsey. And actually, the idea of somebody owning farmland that's rezoned so that it gains this huge notional value. I saw it playing out actually on television, and it was really unusual. It was about 2004 or 5 in Ireland, and there was a press conference called because two brothers who ran a dairy farm in County Clare, their whole farm was about 40 acres, and it was rezoned, and their land was valued at €1 million per acre. And so this was a news story, and for some reason they had a press conference, and these guys were not equipped to be at a press conference, and you could see that they felt uncomfortable. And I mean, they were very intelligent guys, but you could see they were hugely uncomfortable, and they were talking about money, and they were openly talking about what they were worth as people now. And it became a thing that this is what they were worth as people. They were worth €40 million. That was their worth, and that was the news story. And I don't know why it was on the news or why this press conference happened. And you could feel a tension between the brothers and, outwardly. And I think it seems to me as though they were thinking, this isn't worth it. It's not worth 40 million. Maybe I'm totally wrong. Well, probably am, in fairness.
Did they have to leave afterwards? Did they have to
I
leave?
always meant to find out actually what happened. I didn't bother. I do that. I often do that. I'm the laziest researcher in the whole world. I just can't bring myself to even Google.
Okay. But when I would say that the deaths of his parents are almost a second birth for Johnsey, because he's going to be facing life without any protection. And it's quite interesting the way you decided to structure the novel, which is, of course, the course of a year, but more than that, it's about 12 months, and with the rhythm and the pace of seasons. Could you tell us a little bit, how did you come with this idea of organizing this rhythm throughout the novel, and also every month is going to be a time of awakening for Johnsey, because he knows nothing. He is almost as pure as a newborn lamb. He is going to discover sex and friendship and greed and meanness, because he has a very optimistic vision of life and mankind.
Yeah, actually, one of the reasons why I was so unsuccessful as a writer in my lovely haunted apartment in Limerick is because of pace. I could never grasp pace. I could never pace a piece of writing properly. It was always wrong. It just always felt completely unbalanced and wrong. And so I decided at last just to give myself a very definite structure for a narrative, and to let the structure dictate the pace. And so I decided to make this very balanced, to make it calendrical, to have one chapter per month, and to have the chapters of roughly equal length, and to let that be the pace. And so it was such a relief then to be able to do this, and that's why actually, I sent the manuscript to my wonderful publisher in Ireland, Anthony Farrell from Lilliput Press, who's here this evening. And it was called The Thing About December. And Anthony said, I think we'll change the title, it could be better. So, and we actually, our decision was to call it 1 Year in the Life of Johnsey Cunliffe, funnily. And I'm not sure actually why we reverted to The Thing About December, but we did in a way for a finish. I think there were we had so many crazy ideas, we said, no, the original will do, it's fine. And it was such a relief to have this, and it worked very well for the book itself, and it chimed very well with Johnsey's experience, and the fact that he could then recall, how his life looked at that point in the year in his childhood was kind of a nice thing to give the narrative some kind of grounding, and also to give it propulsion. And Johnsey is divested of his shibboleths and his certainties and his comforts and his safety month by month during the book. And it's actually, in many ways, it's a very cruel novel. I'm very cruel to this character who I was so fond of. It's almost sociopathic, actually, what I did to him. If he really was a human. And I know it sounds terrible to say I was so fond of him and then to have done all these terrible things to him. But that's just the way. That's the way I wanted it to be. I wanted to be at the very end that there was nothing left for him, and just to see what would happen, and it happened.
And the rhythm of the seasons and what happens on the farm, because we, in the background of his life and of his 12 months, we see the change of the seasons, and we see all the events which makes the life of agriculture. And was it something you wanted to say about these people choosing to live off the land, on the land, versus the immersion and invasion of city people, seeing land as value only?
Yeah, because I can see how the land is so sacred, and how the rituals of a farm are sacred to people, and I witnessed this. It was part of my childhood. I grew up pretty much on a farm. The house we lived in was actually on farmland, and I worked on the farm with my father in my childhood, and I could see how sacred it was and how beautiful the connection between the people and the land was, and the animals and the crops. It was just an amazing thing. And I wanted this to be part of the book, and because the book I always kind of see it as a book that my father had a huge hand in, because first of all he was my agricultural consultant, but secondly because that's how he feels about the land. He feels about land and farming and the rituals of it the same way that Johnsey's father feels, and so Johnsey's father is very, very much based. Nearly all my very decent, honourable, upright male characters are some kind of iteration of my father. So that was easy to do, and these things, all of these things were very familiar. It was like having a raw material for art readily available at hand. And actually, I remember meeting Darren McKeown, who's here this evening, in New York a couple of years ago, and I was so stunned by his novel because it's set in Russia, and it's so perfect, and you never feel I'm reading a book written by somebody who's not from Russia, who's writing about Russia. It's just you're in the moment, and he gets it so perfectly. And this is where my laziness lets me down, and my inability to get past North Tipperary for the time being. And we've actually gotten as far as Syria for a while, but I came straight back again to Tipperary. But the land, the whole thing of the land and the language being used and the kinds of people in the books, they're very familiar and they're very real, and they were very close at hand. So I couldn't go too far wrong.
Mm-hmm. And with such a character, there was a trap, sentimentality, and you didn't fall in that trap. How did you do this? Because there is a lot of poetry in the book, and Johnsey is not a sentimental character. How did you resist sentimentality?
Yeah, actually, it was quite hard, and I fell into the trap several times. And luckily, my wife, Anne-Marie, is a a really natural editor, and she's got a great eye and a great ear, and she reads everything I write as I write it. And terrifyingly, actually, she was really busy for the last year or so as I was finishing a novel that I just handed in yesterday. And so she wasn't as involved, so it's probably going to be a terrible failure. But she, several times in writing The Spinning Heart and The Thing About December, I became a bit overwhelmed, and the writing, was a bit mawkish and a bit sentimental. There was one chapter, especially in The Spinning Heart, that just didn't work, and I thought it was great. I was convinced it was pure genius. And Anne-Marie said, this is just you lamenting somebody you loved, and it's very obvious, and this is too much. It's just like, it has no bearing on the narrative. It doesn't fit into this book at all. And she was totally right. So I'm lucky to have someone who will actually listen to me talking rubbish every evening, and who will literally have pages shoved under her nose to read on a daily basis to stop me from going completely wrong. If she leaves me, I'm in big trouble. My career is over, pretty much.
And when we read The Thing About December, we feel like there is an effortlessness, but there is a very. It doesn't seem like it was painful for you, or that you had to make many great efforts in order to achieve this kind of writing. But we instantly realize that there is a very chosen way of ordering words on the page. There is something very special. How do you get that result? Is it a lot of editing? How do you work? What is the typical day of Donal Ryan's life as a writer?
I always see my novels as being single drafts, but of course they're not, because what I do is, and I think actually it's just talking to other writers, I think it's fairly unusual, or maybe not, but I write a paragraph a day, because I heard Anne write a few years ago saying she writes a paragraph a day, and I said, well, if I write a paragraph and a half, I'm better than Anne write, so that'll be. So I decided, okay, that'll do me, 300 words, or 500 maybe, a little bit more than a paragraph. And so I write that paragraph in the morning, and then I think about it during the day, and then I rewrite it in the afternoon. And so that paragraph might go through 10 or 15 or 20 incarnations, which I think it works for me. And then this thing incrementally develops into a novel. And so I reached my ideal word count for the novel, and it feels to me as though it has been written in one draft, but I suppose it hasn't really. And I've heard Come to Bean, I know I always quote Come to Bean, but he's very quotable in fairness. And he says he writes a paragraph, and then he takes every single thing out of the paragraph that could be considered a flourish, or something where he's showing off, or some kind of stylistic curlicue. He takes everything out, and so what remains, he reckons, is as pure as possible, which is a good approach, I think.
And with a novel like this one, how much of the original manuscript has been left aside? Did you cut a lot, or did you try to get to the bone and to?
Well, actually, I went terribly wrong twice in the writing of this novel, because I still don't know a whole lot about it. I'm still learning my craft as a writer, as I think you always are. But when I was writing this, I hadn't a clue. I was a complete idiot. And I was writing for 3 hours every night between 9 p.m. and midnight. And I was kind of lost in it, really. And I was just married, and we hadn't had our first child yet. He came along halfway through the manuscript, actually. And he was the impetus for me finishing it, because I said, now that I'm a father, I can't put this thing aside. I have to start when I finish, because I have to be a good example. And I went horribly wrong twice. I completely ruined the story. I went off of these crazy narrative tangents, and that again, I was convinced were inspired, and I was convinced I was one of the greatest geniuses. I was one of the great writers of all time, probably. Absolutely, like the hubris I experienced was horrendous. And twice, Anne-Marie said, "This isn't working. You're actually ruining this book." And both times I had gone about 20,000 words wrong, really. And so those 40,000 words were cut, which is, thank God for it. It wouldn't have been published in the form it was in. Actually, and I have to thank Anthony Farrell, who was the first person to he gave me a career as a writer. Really, it was an intern at the time, Sarah Davis Goff, in his publishing house, who found the manuscript under slush pile. Now, they don't have a slush pile in Lilliput, I have to say. It's a room, a very ordered room with manuscripts respectfully filed against the walls. But Sarah read it and gave it to Anthony, and I think if it had been in the state it was in, you know, without Anne-Marie having told me to change these things, they would have read it maybe and gone, yeah, maybe not. I don't think I'd have gotten a phone call.
We mentioned, of course, Johnsey and his parents, but there are quite a few other characters in the novel. Could you say a few words? Some good ones for Johnsey, some less good ones, some terrible ones.
For some reason, I always forget about Mumbly Dave. There's a character called Mumbly Dave because, like myself, he tends to mumble a little bit, and he never shuts up. And I suppose I have to admit that Mumbly Dave is to a small degree autobiographical. There's a lot of myself in Dave. And in a way, he seems like the I think you called him the anti-Johnsey today, you know, on the outside. And in reality, he's actually very, very like Johnsey. He's also adrift in the world. He's also very alone, and he's also desperately in need of friendship. He's desperately in need of somebody with whom to share his experience. But he's created this alter ego, you know, who is this ladies' man, this womanizer, you know, this guy who's got loads of friends and who kind of goads Johnsey a bit by describing this great life that he has, you know, his constant sex, and he takes drugs, he drinks, and he gets in fights that he always wins, and he's just this gallant who just has this fantastic life, which is all completely false, of course. In reality, he's desperately lonely, like Johnsey, and they form a kind of a very intense friendship. And then there's a character called Siobhan, who just comes along, really, and literally did just come along into the story. I was, you know, making fairly good progress with the novel and thinking this is going okay now. And all of a sudden, this character called Siobhan, who's a nurse, who nurses Johnsey when he's attacked, hospitalized, decided to waltz into my life and into my manuscript and wouldn't go away, like literally wouldn't go away. And I tried to make her go away and she kept coming back. And I know it sounds ridiculous to anthropomorphize fictional characters in such a way, but this actually happened. She insisted on being in the book. And I think, yeah, I really like her, actually. And I couldn't decide myself what her motivation was for being in Johnsey's life. And so I left it open. I'm still not sure, actually. So people make up their own mind about Siobhan all the time. Siobhan is constantly judged, which is, I think, as it should be.
And this is a common point to several of your books. You tend to have a particular tenderness for marginalized people, you know, people who don't fit. We see this, of course, in The Spinning Heart, but also in your short story collection. From where does it come from? You know, your closeness to, in a certain way, self-victims or victims of society, victims of bad luck, of...
I know this is going to reflect badly on me now, but...
in The Slanting of the Sun, there are many bad boys.
Yeah. The only trauma in my childhood, because I had a very, very happy childhood and I had wonderful parents, and the only slight trauma in my childhood was the fact that when I was 9 years old, we moved from a small village to a town. And I suppose I was traumatized by it, because I left my friends in the village in a very small school with 2 teachers and moved to a town and to a huge and violent Christian Brothers school, where there was violence, you know, pretty much constantly. And I was kind of terrified, and I never really had friends again the way I had as a child in the village. And then 4 years later, the guys from the village came to the town to go to secondary school, and I ignored them completely because I was cool, because I was a real townie. I was a heavy metaler, you know, and these guys weren't cool anymore. And I feel awful about that, because they were such lovely guys. But still, you see, because I was trying so hard, I was making such horrendous efforts to fit in, and never quite did fit in. You know, I always had friends, and I have fantastic friends, but I never quite belonged in the town, you know. And even when I played football in the town, you know, I was kind of a traitor for not playing for the village. So so I think there was some sense about me that people picked up on. People like Johnsey. I kind of attracted people who were also slightly marginalized, and I found it easy to communicate with people who found it hard to communicate, if you understand me. It's just a thing. It literally is just a fact. You know, it's like some people are good at soccer and some people are good at this kind of thing. And so I kind of understood how it felt as well to be marginalised, to be pushed out a little bit, or to be kind of looking on from the sideline, from the margins all the time, or to never feel as though you fully fit in. And I think it's probably a good place for a writer to be. If you're right in the thick of things. That's why I think I know sportsmen who are really intelligent and would be great writers, but find it very hard to write, and find it very hard even to write their own memoirs, because they were in the thick of it. They couldn't be fully objective about it. They were so involved in the thing they're writing about that they find it very hard to get out of it and to be objective and to describe it in objective terms. So that's why they normally need ghostwriters. I think that's kind of why. I don't know. I know it sounds a bit wishy-washy now, just to say, "Oh, I had no friends and I was an outsider. That's why I'm a writer." But it kind of is the fact.
And it seems like you have also a certain interest in youth, in young people, young adults, as a defining moment where everything can happen, the best and the worst. Are you aware of this particular interest of yours for this specific time in life?
Yeah, because it is, in some ways, it's such a fantastic time in life. And I so enjoyed my teenage years and my 20s. But I can see it, there's terror there as well, and you're kind of constantly on a precipice. There's danger involved. You can make terrible mistakes very easily. And I have a nephew who's 21, and I'm constantly terrified for him. He's a really tall, good-looking chap, and he's really good at sport, and he's really popular. And his life is fraught with danger that he can't see. He's completely blind to it, And I know he'll make it through, but it's this very dicey time in life. You're on a cliff edge all the time, and you don't know there's a drop just beside you. And of course it takes, I had to be out from that to see it, and to really remember how it felt properly. And again, I think this is another reason, why I spent all these years not being able to write, because I was too close and not far enough removed from the things about which I wrote. Even though, when I wrote Spinning Heart, I was pretty broke, and the main character is a guy who's kind of sinking a little bit. He can't afford to pay the mortgage, and he can't really afford to pay for groceries. And I was kind of, not to the extent that Bobby is, but I was kind of a little bit behind myself with the mortgage at the time. I was in a bit of trouble. I was kind of trying to climb back out of this hole. And so I knew how it felt. So it was a real struggle to be objective about Bobby and about the characters in Spinning Heart. Because you do need to stand back, because writing is an act of kind of almost unreasonable empathy. You're trying to be somebody else. So if what you're writing about is too close to yourself, it can stop seeming like fiction. It can stop being art, actually.
Yeah, somebody said that Irish writers are most of the time obsessed with history. And I would say this is not something that you show in your work yet, but you have a very specific territory influenced by society. Your work has a very strong social dimension. Are you aware of that? Is this something that you are willing to, explore? Do you have a goal? Is there a part of you which shows interest in sociology, in the life of society members? It was very much, of course, at the heart of your first novel, but everywhere, even in your new novel, All We Shall Know, it's also, about people being part of the society and being affected by many elements.
Yeah. It's almost accidental, actually, because again, it goes back to this thing of me having to have readily available raw material. I have to have things that are close at hand and that are familiar to use to fashion into stories. And so the fact that I set all these things in contemporary times, and I use kind of contemporary issues as a backdrop to stories, it causes me to be seen as a chronicler of contemporary Ireland, when that's not what I set out to be at all. It's the people that are important, and they could be anywhere at any time. It doesn't really matter to me. But I suppose I do have an obligation to get it right, and not to present things as they are. The stories, when you create a story about a person, you have total freedom. You can make them do and say whatever you want. But when you're portraying a whole society, you have to kind of, you have an obligation, to look a little bit closely. My new novel, there are members of the traveling community, and so I felt, and I've close friends who are travelers, and I felt a real obligation to these people, not to get it wrong, and not to be judgmental in any way, and not to be patronizing, not to say everyone's great, it's all great, because it's not. There are huge problems in that part of society, as there are in all parts of society. So I mean, I think for the 4 novels I've written and short stories, they're all set in the same time pretty much, and in the same place. And then the novel I just finished, one of the main characters is a Syrian refugee, and the character is based on a story I read in the Guardian newspaper about a doctor from Aleppo who paid something like 15,000 euros at the very start of the conflict in Syria to get out, and he was told he was getting out on a safe boat. He was told, this is a really top quality craft, and this is a very experienced crew, and we'll get you and your wife and daughter across the Mediterranean from Syria. At the time there was no need to go up through Turkey or Jordan to get out. And so he boarded the craft under cover of darkness with his wife and daughter, and halfway across they hit bad weather. And so he decided to go to the bridge to speak to the captain. And he and a fellow passenger went to the bridge and banged on the door and got no reply, and realized eventually there was nobody on the bridge. There was no crew. And so they kicked in the door and realized that there was a GPS system that was guiding the boat across the Mediterranean. And the boat sank, and his wife and daughter were drowned. And he was rescued by a Navy ship and taken to Lesbos, where he still lives, and he works as a brain surgeon, which is it's the most incredible story. And what struck me was that this story was about 1/4 of a page in a newspaper. It wasn't a huge story, it wasn't something that everyone was talking about. And not just because of him, but because this story now is so common. And the story, it's as heartbreaking as it is, it's something we can kind of read and forget about straight away. And it's horrendous. And the reason that, because I know Syrian people who actually are settled in Tipperary, and Syria traditionally was a country of welcomes. I mean, people went into Syria from Lebanon and Jordan and countries around it, and Syrian people had a tradition of renaming city streets to make refugees feel at home, which is an extraordinary fact, I think. And they're just such warm people, and that story kind of stayed with me. I couldn't get it out of my head, so I said, okay, I'm going to write this story. I'll just do it. And so I did. But then I still feel terror at the fact that it's done, that this story is written down by me, because who might tell the story? Mm-hmm. That's something you're kind of faced with a lot. I've actually been asked, like, who are you to tell the story of a woman or a traveller or a refugee or anybody else? But if I just told the story of a 40-year-old white Christian civil servant, it'd be no fun at all.
And you just mentioned reading a piece in The Guardian. Are you paying attention to the paper every day, looking for tiny elements of inspiration? How do you stay tuned to society, to the movement of society?
I try to ignore the news, actually, because I get depressed. I try to just pretend everything's fine, and that it's just my house and my office and my family, and that's it, which is a ridiculous way of viewing the world. But it can be so hard to read the paper now and to watch the news. But you have to. I mean, you can't close your eyes to these things. I don't want to go on too much about it, but on Syria, I wrote a story called Long Puck about a priest who has a church in a town in Syria.
In your short story collection.
Yeah, and the story's called Long Puck, and he brings hurleys with him from Ireland to the church, and he starts to play hurling with locals in the town. And so they have this thing starts where they have a long puck competition in the town, and it ends, the civil war breaks out, and it goes very wrong. But I was asked to read this story to a group of Syrian people, and I said, "Oh, I'm in trouble now. I'm caught out now. The fact that I don't research my stories is going to really bite me in the ass now, because I'm going to read a story set in Syria to people from Syria." And so as I read the story, there was an Arabic translation on a screen beside me, and there was an Arabic translator as well. And I finished, and a woman stood up and said, "I don't believe your story. I think your story doesn't ring true." And she was from Thurles in Tipperary. And thank God, a woman from Syria stood up and said, "I can't believe." When I heard Donal hadn't lived in Syria, I was so surprised. And I said, "I'm never going to bluff again. I have to start to get my act together. I just got away with this. It was horrendous." But again, I mean, it goes back to the whole feeling of having an obligation to get it right in some respect. But then, you know, when you write fiction, you can literally do and say what you want. You know, you're unfettered and unshackled.
And a great part of your professional life, besides, I mean, being a writer, and I know you've been writing stories since the age of 9, something like this, if I am right.
Yeah.
You've been a public servant for many years, a labor inspector. And what did it change in you as a writer? You know, this experience of being immersed in society, into conflicts, into bad problems. You know, of course, we know that it fueled the inspiration for the Spinning Heart. But how did it change your vision of people?
Yeah, there was a time actually when I worked as a labour inspector when I became a bit jaundiced and a bit cynical about things, because there's this whole invisible part of society, and it's not just in Ireland. I think it's everywhere, because we spoke to inspectors in different territories, and slavery is rife. You know, there are people living as slaves all over the place. We entered several premises where people were they were indebted. You know, they were in bondage pretty much. They were working for no wages, and they were working for people who were criminals. You know, and they were being told, "You're working for me, or we'll burn your house down. You know, in the country where you're from, we'll kill your family." This happens all the time in every town pretty much. We went to, and I saw these things, and we were very much in the fringes. We never got to the core of it, and then I realised we didn't really have any anti-slavery laws in Ireland, you know, and so we had to prosecute people for not supplying their employees with payslips or not paying minimum wage, when in reality these people were slave owners who were buying and selling humans. People were being trafficked into the country all the time, you know, on trucks, and there was actually nothing we could do about it, pretty much. You know, because you'd come across a situation where somebody would be, you know, asleep on the ground in a shed with holes in the roof on a mushroom farm somewhere. And so we'd say, "What's going on?" And they'd say, "Well, you know, this person's giving me a job." And they did make a sworn statement that they were being paid and everything was fine. And we'd know in our hearts that this was all untrue. And we'd have to walk away. And that really, really affected me, you know. And I said, I'll take a little bit of a stab, you know, even though I shouldn't really, you know. I said, I'll do something. And I hate the thought of fiction being tendentious, of a writer trying to maneuver a reader towards a certain conclusion. But definitely, those kinds of experiences will always inform what you create. It's unavoidable, because the experiences are so intense and so unexpected, and they'll definitely they change something about you. It was a very interesting time.
Yeah, and so you throughout your fiction, we feel like there is something about the terrible side effects of the global world upon people, you know. With a great negative power of change.
Yeah, if it's just take
and the one you're writing with this Syrian refugee is also finally in the same scope, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose like the thing about December, which is the first novel I wrote, I was actually something approaching happy with. The whole novel is about change. You know, things change rapidly and drastically for the main character, and an interviewer today asked, is Johnsey a metaphor for Ireland? And he's definitely not, but I can see definitely how he could be perceived as so, because of what happens to him, you know, of the transformation that happens in his life and the devastating consequences of it. And so, I mean, you know, we're all involved in a process of growth and renewal and change all the time. It's just a part of existence. But it plays in my mind. You know, even the concept of time and the passage of time is something I think about. I think far too much, to almost an unhealthy degree. But definitely, it's one of the propulsive forces behind fiction. I think behind art, the whole idea of change.
I read somewhere in a review somebody wrote, I don't remember who it was, but maybe you will find out, that the reviewer said that you had a Catholic imagination, but that in your books it was possible to find at equal rate paganism and Christianity. Is this something that is this a definition of your work that you do accept? This, I want you to talk a little bit about Johnsey, who in a very strong way is a Christ-like figure.
Well, just when it comes to paganism and how it's so intertwined with Christianity and Catholicism and the way we practice it in Ireland and lots of other places, I grew up with a mortal fear of pishogues. Pishogues are bad spirits. And so every May Eve, the last day in April, you go around your land or your house and you throw holy water on the ditches to consecrate it, to seal your borders against bad spirits. And you'll still see this being practiced today in Ireland, in country areas. And it became a Christian thing. It became, a thing where you pray to the Virgin Mary while you threw the holy water. But really, really deep down, you were protecting yourself against bad spirits. And because we had this race memory of bad spirits. And pishogues, for some people, are very real. And I grew up believing that there were bad spirits all around that could infiltrate my life and destroy it if I didn't do certain things and be a certain way. And actually, it wasn't gratifying being told I had a Catholic imagination. I don't know even what that actually could mean, because I'm not a very observant Catholic in any shape or form. But it definitely informs the characters I write about. Their religion and their faith, or their lack thereof, informs who they are. Because we're the first, I think my generation is the first almost fully lapsed generation in Ireland. We've almost fully turned our back on the church, which isn't fully positive. And I still go to mass and I still get great comfort from it. And that's something that can be, very easily ridiculed. I remember seeing somebody quoting me saying that, actually, and saying, "Oh, good grief, Donal Ryan goes to mass." And they were saying it like it was a terrible thing, which I was a little bit hurt by, because I get such comfort from the Gospels and from the stories and from the story of Jesus Christ. It's such a great story as well, and which I believe to be true, just as a by the way. And I'm not sure, actually, if I did subconsciously, imbue the narrative very clunkily and awkwardly with this Christian symbolism. Even Johnsey's initials are JC, I do believe, because Cunliffe, I have no idea where the surname Cunliffe came from, and I don't think I'd ever heard the surname Cunliffe. And actually, funnily enough, I saw that years later, I saw the credits of Postman Pat. And one of the creators of Postman Pat was John Cunliffe. So I must have seen it, obviously. I must have. There's kind of a theme of sacrifice in the book. Life is composed of sacrifices. To own land, to be a farmer, you have to make sacrifices. To have a job, you make sacrifices. You sacrifice your freedom, To be in a relationship, to love somebody, to have a friend, all these things require sacrifice. And there are terminal sacrifices in the thing about December. And Johnsey is very pure. And Johnsey, all the major religions, at their very core, they're saying, be kind and love your neighbor. And that's all they're saying, and we put everything else in there. And that's the basis of it. That's all we need to do as a species. It's all we need to do to be happy is be kind. And Johnsey knows this in a very innately. He knows this. It's at a cellular level. He knows this. He's almost viceless, Johnsey. He's almost a perfect soul. He's almost unsullied because of the way he sees the world. And because he has this knowledge inside himself, and because he's so gentle. And it's an accident of birth that he's gentle, and that he has this view and this way of seeing things. And I suppose, again, you can't control how somebody reads what you write, and you can't force somebody towards a certain conclusion. And you can't control it at all. When you create, anything you create is a contract with no terms, and you just literally, you slide a blank piece of paper with contract on it towards somebody, and they can dictate the terms and sign it, and you have no control. And so it's fine. I have no problem being told that I display a Catholic imagination, or that there is heavy Christian symbolism in the book.
And God and religion are absent of the book. There is nothing to. But it's true that Johnsey is very spiritual in both senses. He is funny, but he has a high conscience. He can read people, read situations.
Yeah, it's connected again. Even when it's overt in the book, when Johnsey's father at one stage watches Richard Dawkins on The Late Late Show. The Late Late Show is a chat show in Ireland, and I'm sure you all know who Richard Dawkins is. He's a scientist, and he's a great man, but he's a militant atheist. And Dawkins was on The Late Late Show declaring that there was no God, and we were all very foolish to believe in God, and that to indoctrinate children with religion was tantamount to child abuse. And my father rang me and he goes, put on the Late Late Show. So I put it on and he goes, look at that. They have the devil on the Late Late Show. That's how desperate they were this week now. That's how stuck they were for guests. They have the devil on the Late Late Show. And so I reproduced that verbatim in the book. Because my dad, was convinced of this. And actually my UK publishers, I think, didn't they, Anthony? They had to actually contact Richard Dawkins to see if it's okay. And the reference, there's no names used, but it's pretty obvious from the description that it's Richard Dawkins. So he read it, apparently, and wasn't very happy, but said, okay, go ahead. And I'm grateful for that. But that's because, my parents have such an unquestioning belief. And my mother actually exists in a kind of liminal place where she feels and sees spirits around her. I mean, she's not a psychic, she's very ordinary, she's quite religious, but not overly religious. But an afterlife for her is a matter of fact, and she's had experiences in her life that back this up, and she was very sick once and she was very close to death, and she saw her father who said, no, go back, and these things happened. And she speaks to the dead all the time, not in a spooky way, at all. It's a very natural thing for her. She will have conversations with her mother and her brothers who've died. It's very natural, and it's very lovely, and it's very comforting for her. And the dead for her are very real and very immediate and very present, which I think is a very nice thing to have in your life. And I made Johnsey kind of like that as well. I took these elements of these people I love to make Johnsey, which is maybe why I love him so much.
Once you declared, and I wrote it to quote you perfectly, I feel like I am an imposter when I say I am a writer. Is this still something that you feel? Yeah, why?
I almost always qualify it. I say, if somebody goes, what do you do? I say, well, I'm on career break from the civil service, which I still am actually. So don't quote me or anything I said about civil service or anything else about my job, because I'm still bound by the Official Secrets Act. But I still do. I don't ever say I'm just a writer, because when I do, I seem to pronounce the word not very clearly, because people think I'm a waiter or something else. I don't know. It never comes out right, and I get tongue twisted, and I get embarrassed. And I don't know. I'm not sure why. And it's funny actually. One of the first people I ever spoke to in the literary world was an editor, and he said I could never have a book published. He goes, I'd just be too embarrassed, because people would just think everything I write about is writing about me, and I'd feel very exposed. And I was astonished at this, and then I started to feel the same feeling of exposure very quickly. I have a very close friend who is very embarrassed by the fact that I'm a writer and thinks it's terrible. It's the worst thing that has happened to our friendship, really.
Why? Because he's afraid you would turn him into one of your characters?
I didn't tell him it was. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and now he's convinced he is every character. And actually, my oldest friend, people will see themselves all the time, and they'll catch me out. My oldest friend read The Spinning Heart when it was just a pile of pages, and he became very emotional. And he's a really tough guy. He's served time in prison, not for anything very bad, but he's tough, and he's not given to displays of emotion very easily. But he read The Spinning Heart, and he became convinced that he was Bobby Mann, and I could see a tear in his eye, and I was very surprised. And he said, "Man, you must really love me, because you wrote a book about me," which is actually I felt great. And thinking about it, there are definitely huge elements of him in the character. So it was safe to let him think that I had written a book about him. He's very happy about it.
So if you don't sometimes accept the fact that you are a writer, would you accept the fact that you are a reader, that behind every writer there is a reader? What kind of reader have you been since the age of learning how to read? And what kind of reader are you today?
Firstly, there are only two things, and everyone knows this at a very basic level. There are only two things you must do to be a writer. First of all, you have to read. There's no other apprenticeship you can serve. And you have to write, which it sounds like a truism, but it's one thing people forget. People say I want to write and never ever write, because I was the same myself for years. I never practiced actually writing. But if you don't read, language just becomes brittle. It becomes frigid. It's like plasticine. If you leave it aside, it just gets hard and useless. And the more you read, the more malleable and the more usable language becomes. It softens up, and it becomes something that you can twist and tear and bend around and play with, which is an amazing thing. But my parents had a laissez-faire attitude. My parents bought books everywhere they went. You know, they would buy boxes of books and they'd empty the books onto the floor at home, and every kind of book. There was one book that I was not allowed to read, and that was I, Claudius by Robert Graves. And I just finished it now. I forgot. I put it aside for years. It was so ingrained. My mum said, don't read that book, you know, and it was at home for years. And I'd pick it up, and she'd go, no, you can't read that. I'm not sure why. I know there's terrible things happen, but nothing, you know, very explicitly described. But we were allowed to read whatever we wanted. And when I was really young, I read Norman Mailer's The Executioner's Song. And he describes Gary Gilmore's execution. And I thought this was made up. I didn't realize this actually had all happened. And Gary Gilmore was the first person to be executed in America after a Supreme Court ruling was overturned after 14 years. And so Gary Gilmore was executed in Utah, and he decided to be executed by firing squad in 1974 or 5, I think. And Mailer describes a drop of blood leaving his wound and landing on the lace of his prison-issue trainer. And I read this at about maybe 10 or 11 years old. And the image of that drop of blood on his trainer, it just seared into me. And from that moment, I was vehemently opposed to capital punishment. You know, I just hated the idea of somebody being strapped to a chair and killed by his own government or her own government. It was just the most horrendous notion. And it really changed the way I saw the world at that moment. And it changed the way I saw books, because this had such a powerful effect. I was so upset by it for a start. You know, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Then realized it really happened, got more upset. But then the idea that these words had been written by this guy who was thousands of miles away, who I would never meet, and he had made this picture from words that was in my head now, seemed like the most amazing, wonderful thing, you know, and I was determined to do it myself. And so, I mean, I have to thank my parents, because they just filled our lives with books when we were kids, and filled the house with books. Not saying that you have to have that exact childhood to be a writer, but you do have to read.
And what about today, when you write only fiction? Do you tend not to read fiction when you are in the process of writing a novel, or do you go back to certain writers you care for? What are your reading habits?
No, I read all the time, actually, because one of the great things about being published is that you get free books in the post all the time, at least 2 or 3 times a week, and it's fantastic, you know, so there's always a book to read. But I do find, actually, and it's something I have to really be conscious of and to be careful about. If you read a book that's heavily stylized, you know, where somebody has a wonderful signature style and it's amazing, and they've got these beautiful flourishes and this beautiful way of doing things, and these lovely writing habits, you know, these lovely linguistic habits, I actually am very easily influenced, and I find them showing up in what I write myself, and I have to be aware of it. I have to really watch out for that, because it can happen. And I know writers who don't read at all while they're involved in a novel or a story. But it just seems unavoidable. You know, I can't imagine life without reading. It's kind of the stuff of life, as Anthony Farrell says.
And for a few years now, you've been teaching at the University of Limerick, teaching books. And what has it changed for you as a writer? You know, to not only being immersed in your own work, but also being immersed in other writers' work and teaching other writers' work. And what has because you are teaching creative writing, what did the relation with students change in your vision of writing, in your vision of fiction?
Well, I was plunged very quickly and violently back towards the notion that I'm a fraud, because I was standing in a university teaching MA students something I felt I didn't know very much about, and everything I said I just made up in that moment, and everything I said was a total bluff, and I was presenting myself as this big expert, you know, and they totally trusted me, which was terrifying, and so it took me a while to get used to that fact. But the thing is, you can't really teach, you can't be prescriptive, you can't say, here are all the things that you have to do to make a story good. This is how you have to write, because it's so personal, it's so individual, and it's so different for everybody. And everyone's experience is so different. The main thing you do as a teacher of creative writing, or a so-called teacher of creative writing, is listen and read what the person has written and try to give them space and direction. It's all you can do, because you can't tell somebody what to write. It has to be from themselves. And obviously there are certain things you have to do, you know. But it's kind of... I wish that there had been an MA course or some kind of course like that when I was in my 10 years in my haunted apartment, because it wouldn't have been 10 years, it would have been compressed. I would have actually finished something, I would have actually let somebody read something. I would have forced myself not to be embarrassed, I would have given something I'd written to somebody to read. And it would have been great. And I think that's the great thing about courses in creative writing and MA courses, that you actually force yourself to be a writer for that small space of time, and you compress what you might take years ruminating over, into a small space of time, and you have to write. You're forced to write because, again, it's truism, but to be a writer, you have to write.
But you, at the same time, you have been hailed as one of the most exciting voices in contemporary Irish fiction. How do you face the fact that these students who come to your class, they don't see you as a fraud, they see you as Donal Ryan. So, and they may have read some of your books. So how does it work with them? How do you react to that, and how do you engage with them?
What I used to do was, very childishly, I would try to suss out whether or not they liked my books. I would try to read their body language, and I would look for signs and signals in their language and the way they really greeted me. Even are they a fan or not? Narcissism was horrendous, because loads of people don't like my books. That's totally okay. But that aside, it actually is. I feel actually that I've been helped more as a writer than my students sometimes, because it's forced me to actually examine how I write. Because I've had to go outside the process of writing and actually think about it, to articulate what it is for me to be a writer and how I actually get words onto the page. And I've actually considered things that had been unconscious. I've considered things, I've examined them, things that I hadn't actually known I did. And it's been a great help. And I definitely have developed as a writer. And it's stopped me kind of sitting there thinking what I do next. It's given me structure. Joseph O'Connor is the Frank McCourt Chair of Creative Writing in UL, and he says very wisely, and he was one of my heroes actually as a writer. He said, no one should be just a writer. You have to do something else as well. And so I'm very happy that he gave me a job in UL teaching. But it's not the easiest job in the world because of that, just that, because of the idea of teaching creative writing. It's a strange notion,
Has this changed your perspective? Because there is a big difference from writing in your study at home or at the end of your workday and being part of a university with a literary tradition. Has it changed something in your vision of being a writer? Do you feel less of an imposter now that you are, in the company of other writers, in the company of aspiring writers?
Well, I'm an inveterate worrier. I worry is kind of a genetic thing with me. I was thinking about my grandfather. I used to see my grandfather in the kitchen all the time when he was 80 years old, and he'd be opening and closing the fridge door because he was so worried that the light in the fridge didn't go off when he closed the door. So he'd be like this. And he'd be like this for long periods because this was a real worry that gnawed at him, and he worried about all sorts of things. And I do as well. I worry constantly about absolutely every part of my life. And it stopped me worrying a little bit, which is great, because when I'm at home for some reason, I'm thinking, God, I'm supporting my family now, and I've been paid in advance for this next book, and I haven't written any of the book yet. And that's a terror, a constant terror in my life, to have a deal to write books, to be paid an amount of money, to write books I haven't written, it causes huge fear. And so because I have to be structured, and I have to be organized, and I have to get certain things done by a certain time of the day, it's been a great help, definitely.
Does it mean that every new book is a frightening challenge for you? Or do you start a new book with joy and with energy? Or do you see it as a threat or as a place of danger?
Yeah, I get far too freaked out. I can't relax at all. And I thought I would. It's been a few years now, so I thought gradually I'll relax a little bit and I'll stop worrying too much. But it hasn't happened yet. Maybe after the next book, I'll keep saying that. Next book will be fine. I won't freak out at all. It'll be totally okay. I mean, I discovered all sorts of terrible things about myself since I became a writer. Like that I can be bullied. I never thought this was possible, actually, because I always saw myself as being quite tough. And I had a job for a few years unofficially as a person who tackled bullies and who took on bullies. Literally sorted out bullies. And I always felt really, really bad for people who were bullied in the workplace because it's an awful thing. to be bullied at work, because it's always so invidious, and it's always so incremental, and it can destroy a person's life. And so my job, unofficially, in a place where I worked, was to stop this happening. And I was really good at it. I was really effective, I was a tough nut. And I thought, this is my calling, really. And then I saw a tweet one day, and the tweet was from a really famous writer. And I'm not on Twitter, but my friend rang me and he goes, do you know this writer? And I said, no. And he said, geez, man, she really hates you. So I saw these tweets, and she had something like, 500,000 followers, and she was calling the Spinning Heart shit, basically. And I found myself lying on the ground in a fetal position, curled up in a ball, crying like a baby. I was going, they all hate me, and I felt as though they were actually kicking me, And this was an epiphany, this discovery about myself, that I could be like this, I could be actually lying on my kitchen floor crying because of a tweet. This was really, really strange, This completely shook my perception of myself, to the core. So these things happen, and the whole fact that it doesn't feel comfortable yet. It doesn't feel right. The actual act of writing feels right. It always does. When actually, even when it's not going well, it feels right. But everything else around it never feels quite right.
If many of your books are seen through the eyes of men, your latest novel, All We Shall Know, has a female character, and a prominent female character. Her name is Melody, and she's sharing a common situation as many of your characters. She's facing a time of change. And there is something quite interesting, because it sounds like numbers are also defining your work. 21 narrators in The Spinning Heart, 12 months in the life of Johnsey Cunliffe, and 9 months in the life of Melody O'Shea, because she's expecting a baby. She's pregnant, but the problem is the father is not her husband, Pat. And she's a teacher, and the baby's father is one of her students, a young traveler boy from she met in class, and he's only 17 years old, and he left already. So it sounds like you want to put people into tough situations. But how was it to write Melody? To take that big challenge of fiction, going to the unknown, to going into the skin of somebody so different from you.
Well, Melody actually, she wasn't very hard actually. I have a sister who I'm very close to, and I love her very much, but she's gloriously unhinged. She's literally a space cadet. I mean, she just has this mad way of seeing the world and of interacting with the world. And I use lots of my sister for Melody, which she's fine with this, Now, the dark parts of Melody aren't my sister, but the unhinged parts are. And her voice, it's terrible to say, but I pictured Melody as Mary, and I heard her voice from Melody's voice. And you see, and again, like an Egypt, I fell in love with the character, and then became crazily protective of the character, and really, got upset when I saw people calling her, even, in really kind, really good reviews, people saying, the main character is hideous, the main character is irredeemable. And I was thinking, she's not, she's great, she's lovely, I think she's fantastic. But I can see, she does terrible things, but we all do terrible things from time to time. It's just that Melody's very honest about it and very forthright in her confession. But again, it's a slightly confessional work, like Spinning Heart. But to whom the confession is being told or being made isn't quite clear. But Melody literally lets it all hang out. She exposes the interior of herself to the reader. And it was a really fun, enjoyable book to write, actually. And I was kind of dangerously happy with it at the end, thinking, that's grand, that's good, and you should never be happy. I think, you should always think that it could have been far better. And I heard John Benville, I tend to just quote John Benville and come to being all the time, and probably misquote wildly as well, but he said he's embarrassed by everything he's ever written, which is, I don't believe that, to be honest, no, but I can see kind of how you can be embarrassed by what's out there, what's on shelves all over the world, and all the mistakes are still in there, and all the things that could be better are still there, and all the things that aren't quite as good as they could have been are there. But there's a point where you have to just stop. You have to stop and say it's finished.
So what do you feel when back home you meet readers in bookstores, at festivals. What kind of reaction do you get from the people who read your book, your books, and which one is the favorite of them? And how do you see the writer in their eyes and in their words?
There's no experience like as a writer. There's no experience like meeting readers. It's just the most amazing thing, and it's still. I can't believe it. You know, when I meet somebody and they have my book in their hand and they've read it, it's just so unbelievable to me. And when the characters seem real to them, it is the most gratifying thing. And when they speak about the characters in terms of real people, I love that, because I always try to narrow the distance between the reader and what they're reading, to the point where they forget the reading. You know, and that's the aim. I mean, the aim of every writer is not to exist in the reader's mind, is to disappear. And so when people speak about the characters and they've been upset or they're happy or they found it funny, it's an amazing thing. And sometimes somebody will come along and they'll go, "I hated that." You know, it's always kind of funny, and it's totally fine, because I mean everyone's different. It's almost as interesting, actually. Well, it's actually more interesting when someone has a really bad reaction. I mean, like very early on, I read. I'm always stuck with negative things. But I read in Dunleary at a literary lunch. I don't know what the hell it was about. I just went and read anyway. And afterwards, I read a short story that I thought was okay, you know. And I hadn't written many short stories at the time. And afterwards, there was a Q&A, and a lady stood up, and she was very elegant. And I stood there waiting for her encomium for my story. And she said, "You're a disgrace." I said, "You're a disgrace. You're a disgrace to your parents, you're a disgrace to literature, and you're a disgrace to Ireland." So I thought she was joking. I presume she was joking. So I started laughing like an imbecile, going "Ah!" with terror, with mounting terror. And she went on to expand on this and say that I had reintroduced paddywhackery to Irish letters, and that the only reason I was nominated for the Booker Prize was because the English were all laughing at us. And they were laughing at Ireland through me. And they were giving me this little bit of a boost as a way of ridiculing me and ridiculing Ireland, because I was doing it for them, and they were so happy. And, you know, it's a great story, to tell now, but at the time I was upset, but she still had a glorious reaction to the book, you know. And there was something wonderful about the way she reacted. You know, because she was and her reaction was so considered as well, and so articulate, you know, and so cutting, and really gloriously cutting, like biting. She bit right in, she cut right into the very core of me. She did some job.
One last question before we listen to you read an excerpt of The Thing About December, and then we can engage a conversation together with the people here tonight. What is your relationship with bookstores and libraries? Do they play a big role in your life? Do you tend to travel throughout the country to meet readers in bookstores or libraries? What is your relationship to the places where books are?
Yeah, I hate to deploy kind of trite praise to people, but booksellers are just they're like heroes, you know, because small bookshops struggle so fiercely, and they scrap, they fight so hard just to stay open, to stay alive. All booksellers do, and I mean, without them, we'd be sunk. And so I love going to bookshops, but I've always loved bookshops anyway. I love the smell of books and the feel of books, and I love the places. And the people are nearly always really interesting and really warm and really, you know, and really into books, obviously, which is a great thing. So I love going to bookshops. I go to schools a lot because the Spinning Heart is on the Leaving Cert, and so I go to schools, and of course I'm worried that everything I say will be taken down verbatim and regurgitated in Leaving Cert, and these children will fail, because the examiner will say that's rubbish, but the child will think, well, the writer said it, so it has to be true, which isn't the case at all, of course. And libraries as well, of course. I mean, there seems to be a bureaucratic push against libraries at the moment in Ireland. You know, libraries are being compromised, de-staffed, denuded of books, closed down in some cases, which is horrific, because they're so important to so many people.
I read tonight in the New York Times that Donald Trump is going to end the National Endowment for the Arts, National Endowment for Humanities. So it sounds like in America they are going to be in trouble.
I'm just horrified that his name contains my name. But I can't change it now, I suppose it's too late.
So, would you mind reading
No.
a little excerpt
I'd
of
be
the
delighted.
novel? And then we can maybe use the mic and have you ask questions to Donald if you feel like it.
So I'll read a section where where it's not too dark. Johnsey is in pretty good form. So as we were saying, the book is structured calendrically, and at the start of each chapter, Johnsey, who is around 24 in the novel, recalls what his childhood looked like at that point in the year. So, some of it will be a little bit like a non sequitur, but you'll know what I'm getting at. So this is July. At this point, he's been attacked and hospitalized, and this has turned out to be the best thing that's ever happened to him. No school in July. You could give every day knocking about the farm with Daddy. Or if he was right busy or had to go off laying blocks, you could stay in the kitchen, and Mother would allow you to sit up on the worktop and watch her baking. Or you could walk over across the river field and see could you spot a rabbit or a hedgehog along by the ditches, or maybe even a diving kingfisher. The sun didn't always split the stones, but even if it rained, it was never cold, and the earth would steam after it. And you could even swim while it rained. And you could kind of know then how the wild animals felt, being free. Daddy would bring Johnsey to the Munster final. That's a hurling match in Ireland. And Paddy Rourke would go with them as a rule. If the match was on in Cork, they'd stop at the hotel in Mitchelstown on the way down for their breakfast. They always did a beautiful breakfast in that hotel. One time, Daddy was going mad looking for more toast, but the waitress must have gone off on her break or something. So Daddy bowled off into the kitchen to make his own toast to hell. And Johnsey was scared in case he got in trouble. And Paddy shook his head and said, "Your daddy is a madman." And a few minutes later, he came running back out with a big plate of toast and a load more rashers, and a one behind him waving a wooden spoon. Maria, she was awful cross with him, but she was laughing, and Paddy and Johnsey roared laughing too. And there were a few more there in Tipperary jerseys, and they all cheered, and it was a pure howl. The pecker Dunn would always be busking below outside the stadium with a big pile of wild-looking children, and Daddy was mad about him. And he'd always put money in their box and salute the pecker, and the pecker would salute him back. And 'twasn't everyone got a salute off of the legendary Pecker Dunn, and Johnsey would be pure proud. If Tip bet Cork in the Munster final, Daddy would be as high as a kite on the way home. He'd shout, "Whoa, boys, we've Cork betting the hay saved. Now we have a proper summer." It's easy to be happy in July. Johnsey now knew what it was like to be in love. One way, hopeless love, he knew, but still love. It was like the time they'd had a stand-in teacher inside in the tech. A little blonde lady, straight from university. She was a fine thing, all the townie boys said. And they gave many a break time over to discussions of her, and how you could definitely see her nipples through her blouse. And that was a sure sign she was mad for riding. Actually, I'm sorry I read that, actually, and I almost always drop that sentence, because I do have a very real sense of my grandmother at my right shoulder, and she's saying, "Don't make a show of us now. leave out all the dirty words now, okay?" And so, and I normally drop that, but this isn't my copy, so I haven't got it crossed out with my barrow. Johnsey admired their brave talk, but secretly he preferred her pale green eyes to any other part of her, and the soft sound of her voice. She read out this poem in class one time. Johnsey never forgot what it was called, "The Dong with the Luminous Nose." It was about a woeful, ugly creature called the Dong, who was head over heels in love with a beautiful woman who could never return his love. His love for her was unrequited. Miss had written the word on the blackboard and underlined it twice, and Johnsey had not forgotten the spelling nor its meaning. Unrequited, not returned, not given back. The whole class stayed quiet for that whole long poem, and afterwards, instead of guffaws and smart comments, there was only a strange sort of silence, like some kind of desperate sickness, had befallen lads who just a few minutes previously had been full of the joys of spring. He was one of the thickest lads in that class, but even Johnsey knew what she was at, that little blonde lady from the university, that shining angel among all those dirty devils. She was telling them all they were only a shower of lovesick dongs, and she knew full well how they talked about her. But she also knew each one of them was some way in love with her, and they could sail away in their little boats and drown themselves in a sea of longing for all she cared. She'd never return their stupid, sweaty love. It was unrequited.
Alors, est-ce que quelqu'un souhaiterait poser une question à Donal Ryan, pas forcément sur Johnsey Cunliffe, mais sur son travail en général ou sur l'un de ses livres en particulier? Ok.
Yeah, you know, actually, the process of creating melody and of giving her a voice felt exactly the same as for male characters, because I never considered the gender really, and I only considered the fact that I know nothing for a fact about somebody else, and none of us do. You know, it's like the conundrum in philosophy. You know, you can never prove to somebody that you see a color the same way that they see it, you know, or vice versa. And so you can never be sure how it feels to be somebody else. And so fiction is always just guesswork. You're always guessing, and your guesses are informed to greater or lesser degrees by your experience. And so it didn't feel different, you know. And I mean, the female voices, I did it in The Spinning Heart with female voices, and there's some in The Thing About December, but it didn't feel any different. And I think if it feels real and feels right to people, that's my good fortune. You know, it's luck. I lucked out. You know, and I've had the devil's luck really so far when it comes to being a writer. A lot of luck really. Can I just say, actually, perhaps to encourage questions, my wife does really give out to me for being far too honest, especially in Q&A sessions. She says, just make up lies. Don't tell the truth all the time. Definitely, actually, and I spoke about this lately, and I have to say, actually, that the cliche is that, you know, to be a civil servant who longs to be an artist, but I really am an artist who longs to be a civil servant. I loved my job. I really loved it, but definitely the fact that I prepared cases for prosecution on a daily basis, and the language I used had to be so precise. You know, it had to be completely, exactly perfect. You know, and when you're quoting legislation and you're attaching legislation to files, it has to be so. There has to be symmetry to it. It has to be absolute perfection, because, you know, a word in the wrong place is a collapsed case. And so to be unshackled from that when I went home to write was just, it emphasized the joy of fiction for me, really. And it definitely helped. But I mean, the experiences I had as a person, even, you know, in my old jobs in IT and civil service and as a clerical officer, I loved them all. You know, it's a great place to be. It really is. But then, you know, we were all told in 2008 that it was all our fault. You know, we had fucked the country up, really, as civil servants, with our huge, obscene wages and our massive pensions. You know, it was all our fault. It wasn't the developers or the Anglo-Irish Bank, it was the civil servants. So we took the blame, took the hit. You know, we lost a quarter of our income, and I felt very hard done by, to be honest, when that happened. But definitely, yeah, the whole act of using language in such an absolutely precise way, and in such a way that had fear of abject fear of immediate failure attached to it, informed the way I wrote when I went home, definitely. Hi. Yeah, I know what you mean, actually. And Paul Lynch and I have discussed this at length, actually, this whole idea of anti-pastoral. And you know, I always feel terrible when people say to me, you portray country people and the country and land in a very negative way, you know, in sometimes almost demonic way. You know, you actually imbue the act of landowning with a kind of, you vilify people in the country for the way they act and the way they think about land. And I never intended that, you know. It's actually what happened to land. It's actually the changed perception of land around the start of the century that I was really fascinated by, you know, when it was always a thing to survive on. It was always a thing that gave life. Now it was going to give riches, which is a different thing completely. And it, you know, our perception of ourselves changed so rapidly and so completely. And then obviously, you know, we reverted and we felt foolish. We went, oh God, the whole world saw us being Egypts for the last 7 or 8 years. And now we have to kind of just be quiet and get through this mess we're in and clean it up a bit. But you know, I never set out with any agenda, and I never set out with any kind of plan to make people see things a certain way or to present things a certain way. And kind of when you write fiction, what happens. It always seems to happen naturally. I mean, I know, of course, you're driving it yourself, but sometimes it gets away in you and it becomes something that you hadn't intended, and that might be okay. And it is, again, it's the whole thing of issuing a blank contract and allowing the person who will agree to it ultimately to set the terms. This is the thing. I think that translators are just amazing people, and it seems to me as though, I mean, my French is just enough to get by in a restaurant, and almost always the waiter will be kindly smile at me and say, yeah, I know what you mean. So I can't say for certain, but I mean, I know that Marina has done an amazing job, and I think she seems, because of what people have said to me about Johnsey and about the language, about the characters. And even today, a radio interviewer, he just really he seems to have fallen for Johnsey somehow, you know, and he was talking about him in the exact terms that I talk about him in, and he read the book in French, so that gave me great hope for Marina's translation being true, and I've no doubt that it really is, but I have no idea how she did it. I've no idea how it's possible. I didn't think that these books were translatable, to be honest. I mean, The Spinning Heart is in, I think, 20 languages now. It's in Japanese, it's in Hebrew. I have no idea how this is possible. No idea.
The best answer to that question is to read not all the passage that Donald read in English, but to read it in French, so you can appreciate Juillet. En juillet, pas d'école. On pouvait crapahuter sur les terres avec papa du matin au soir. Et si jamais il était débordé ou s'il devait travailler sur un chantier, il y avait toujours la cuisine et maman qui le laissait se percher sur le comptoir pour la regarder pétrir sa pâte, ou bien il se promenait dans le champ en bordure de la rivière, pistant un lapin ou un hérisson le long des fossés, guettant un martin pêcheur en plein plongeon. Il ne faisait pas toujours une chaleur de plomb, mais même par temps pluvieux, l'air n'était jamais très froid. La terre fumait après la pluie et on pouvait toujours se baigner sous l'averse. Dans ces moments-là, on devinait ce à quoi devait ressembler la liberté d'un animal sauvage. Papa emmenait Johnsey à la finale régionale de hurling et en général, Paddy Rourke les accompagnait. Si elle avait lieu à Cork, ils s'arrêtaient en chemin pour petit déjeuner dans un hôtel de Mitchelstown. Leurs œufs au bacon étaient un délice. Une fois, papa avait réclamé un supplément de toast à corps et à cri, mais la petite serveuse avait dû partir en pause. Du coup, il s'était engouffré dans les cuisines pour se les préparer lui-même. Johnsey avait eu peur qu'il s'attire des ennuis, et Paddy avait traité papa de toqué. Au bout de quelques minutes, il était ressorti avec une grande assiette de tartines et une énorme portion de bacon, pourchassé par une grande gaillarde armée d'une cuillère en bois. La femme faisait semblant d'être furax, mais en vérité elle riait. Alors papa et Paddy ont hurlé de rire eux aussi. Et il y avait dans la salle quelques supporters de l'équipe de Tipperary qui l'ont acclamé. Une franche rigolade, quoi. Les jours de match, Pickerdune se postait toujours devant l'entrée du stade avec toute une flopée de gosses pas vraiment d'aplomb. Et papa, qui l'adorait, glissait quelques sous dans leur caisse en saluant Pécœur, et Pécœur aussi lui disait bonjour. Ce n'était pas tout le monde qui avait droit au bonjour du légendaire Pécœur Dieu. Johnsey était fier comme un pape de voir ça. S'il battait Cork en finale, papa planait sur son petit nuage pendant tout le trajet du retour. Ouais, criait-il, Cork a pris la raclée et les foins sont rentrés. L'été peut vraiment commencer. En juillet, c'est facile d'être heureux. Mais la question de la traduction, elle est bien entendu au cœur de toutes les littératures qui ne sont pas écrites dans votre langue. Et c'est vrai que les difficultés, et comme Carole a aussi pas mal travaillé sur les problèmes quand ils se posaient au fur et à mesure, c'est que parfois il faut trouver un équivalent dans notre langue, dans nos références, dans nos images. C'est vrai que la traduction littérale d'une image typiquement irlandaise qui ne dit rien en français, forcément elle ne fonctionne pas. Donc il faut trouver quelque chose qui se rapproche dans la langue, dans les images, pour avoir l'équivalent. Et parfois, traduire, c'est trahir légèrement pour être finalement plus fidèle à l'original. Sorry about that. It was said in French. I was, saying that sometimes to be very faithful, you have to be less faithful to the original and find an image in our language and our culture.
Yes, of course, yeah.
The translation either more closer to the original.
Yes, yeah. It's very important. Actually, can I take this opportunity to thank Francis Jafar and Carol Menville and everybody, Albin Michel, for publishing this book so beautifully in French. It's a joy to be published by Albin Michel in France. And can I thank also Sinead Nickay and everybody here at the Irish Cultural Centre, which is a wonderful place. I've been staying here the last few nights, and it's just been fantastic being here. And also Anthony Farrell, my dear Anthony, without whom I wouldn't have a career as a writer, or any career at all, really, to be honest, from Lilliput Press. And my dear friend Alan Hayes, who's here actually, who's been giving me advice constantly for the last 5 years, and his advice is always amazingly good. And my colleague Darren McKeown, I neglected to mention his beautiful novel is called All That Is Solid Melts Into Air, a title of which I'm very jealous, and a book actually of which I'm very jealous because it's so achingly beautiful, set in Belarus. And thanks so much to you all for coming.
Et si certains parmi vous souhaiteraient faire dédicacer à Donal la version française de The Thing About December, il y a quelques exemplaires qu'on a apportés, il n'y en a pas beaucoup, mais si certains d'entre vous souhaitent en acquérir un, c'est bien entendu possible. Merci Sinead, merci à la régie, et merci en tous les cas d'avoir été des nôtres ce soir pour ce moment en compagnie de Donal Ryan.
Thank you so much. Thanks a million.